The men who hated Jesus most were not ignorant. They were not pagans who had never read the scriptures. They were not Romans who dismissed Jewish religion as barbaric superstition. They were not casual observers who misunderstood what Jesus was claiming. The men who hated Jesus most were the people who had spent their entire lives studying the same text Jesus quoted, praying to the same God Jesus prayed to, living in the same tradition Jesus claimed to fulfill. They were the scribes and the Pharisees and the chief priests and the teachers of the law. They were the people who had memorized the Torah before they were 12 years old. They were the people who debated the meaning of Scripture with a precision and a rigor that would put most modern biblical scholars to shame. They were, by any reasonable measure, the most knowledgeable religious people in first century Judea. And they wanted Jesus dead, not merely dismissed, not merely ignored, not merely argued against and refuted and sent away dead. The Gospel of Mark, the earliest of the four canonical Gospels, records that the Pharisees and the Herodians began plotting to kill Jesus as early as chapter 3, after he healed a man on the Sabbath. Chapter 3. The opposition is not a late development in the story, it is almost immediate. And it intensifies with every subsequent chapter until the high priest tears his clothes at Jesus' trial and calls his words blasphemy, and the crowd outside demands crucifixion. Why? That is the question that most Christians have been given a simple answer to, and that most secular people have been given no answer to at all. The simple Christian answer is that the religious leaders of first century Judaism were spiritually blind, hardened in their hearts, so attached to their own power and their own traditions that they could not recognize the fulfillment of everything they claimed to believe in when it stood in front of them. The secular answer, when one is offered at all, is that Jesus was a social reformer, threatening the economic and political interests of the priestly establishment, and they eliminated him the way powerful institutions always eliminate threats to their power. Both of these answers contain something real, and both of them miss something essential. Because the conflict between Jesus and the religious leadership of first century Judaism was not primarily about power, though power was involved. And it was not primarily about spiritual blindness, though the gospel writers clearly believe that spiritual factors were at work. It was primarily about theology, about specific, technical, sophisticated theological disagreements between people who all knew the same texts and who drew from those texts completely different conclusions about what God was doing in their world and what faithfulness to God required. And when you understand those theological disagreements in their actual first century context, the hostility of the religious leadership becomes not only comprehensible, but from within their own framework, almost inevitable. They were not stupid. They were not simply corrupt. They were people with a coherent theological vision who encountered someone making claims that within that vision could only be understood as either the most important thing that had ever happened or the most dangerous blasphemy in the history of their tradition. And they chose the second option. And understanding why they chose it, understanding what they saw when they looked at Jesus through the lens of their own theology, is one of the most important and most neglected questions in the history of Western religion. Welcome to this channel, where ancient secrets meet modern questions. To understand why the people who knew the Bible best hated Jesus, you first need to understand who those people actually were. Because the popular image of the Pharisees and the scribes and the chief priests is almost entirely a caricature derived from the polemic of the gospel texts themselves. And that caricature has distorted the historical picture almost beyond recognition. The Pharisees were not hypocrites, by definition. The word Pharisee comes from the Hebrew Perushim, meaning separated ones, and the separation they practiced was a rigorous personal piety focused on the extension of temple purity regulations into everyday life. They believed that all of Israel, not just the priests, was called to live in a state of ritual purity, and they developed an elaborate oral tradition, what they called the oral Torah, to specify exactly how that purity was to be maintained in every situation of daily life. The Pharisees were enormously popular with ordinary Jewish people, precisely because their program was a democratization of holiness. They were saying, you do not need to be a priest to live a holy life. You do not need to be in the temple to be in the presence of God. Every meal eaten in purity is a sacred meal. Every act of daily life performed according to the oral Torah is an act of worship. The scholar Jacob Neusner of Brown University, who spent a career studying the Pharisaic tradition, describes the Pharisees as the forerunners of rabbinic Judaism and as one of the most sophisticated and intellectually serious religious movements of the ancient world. Their oral tradition, which would eventually be codified in the Mishnah and the Talmud, represents an extraordinarily careful and creative engagement with the question of how to live faithfully in a world where the temple and the priesthood do not have a monopoly on the sacred. The chief priests and the Sadducees were a different kind of movement entirely. The Sadducees were an aristocratic party closely associated with the high priestly families in the temple establishment. They accepted only the written Torah as binding and rejected the oral tradition of the Pharisees. They did not believe in resurrection of the dead, a point the gospel texts record explicitly, and that was a genuine and significant theological divide with the Pharisees. They were the establishment party, the people who had accommodated themselves to Roman rule and who maintained their power through their control of the temple and their cooperation with the Roman governor. The scribes were a professional class of Torah scholars and legal experts who could belong to either the Pharisaic or the Sadducean tradition. Their expertise was in the interpretation and application of the written Torah, and in a society where the Torah functioned as the legal and constitutional foundation of Jewish communal life, their expertise was both socially essential and socially powerful. These are the people who opposed Jesus, and they were not, most of them, cynical opportunists who privately knew Jesus was right and publicly opposed him for reasons of self-interest, though the gospel text suggests some of them may have been. Most of them were people with genuine theological commitments who encountered Jesus's teaching and activity and found it, within their theological framework, deeply and genuinely wrong. So, what exactly did they find wrong? Let us go through the specific theological flashpoints because each of them illuminates a different dimension of the conflict. The first and most immediate flashpoint was the Sabbath. The Gospel of Mark records multiple Sabbath controversies in rapid succession, and the speed with which these controversies lead to calls for Jesus' death tells you something important about how serious the Sabbath issue was in first century Judaism. The Sabbath was not merely a day of rest in the sense that a modern person understands a day off. The Sabbath was the sign of the covenant between God and Israel, the weekly enactment of the creation narrative, the most visible marker of Jewish distinctiveness in a Hellenistic world that found the Sabbath incomprehensible and often mocked it as laziness. During the Maccabean period, Jews had died rather than violate the Sabbath. The Maccabean revolt itself had partly been triggered by the desecration of the Sabbath by Seleucid forces and by the deaths of Jews who refused to fight on the Sabbath even in self-defense. The Sabbath was not a minor ceremonial regulation. It was a matter of life and death, theologically and literally. The Pharisaic oral tradition had developed an elaborate system of Sabbath regulations designed to specify exactly what was and was not permitted, and the underlying logic of that system was protective. By specifying what constituted work in 39 specific categories, the oral tradition created a fence around the Sabbath commandment, a set of precautionary rules that ensured you would never accidentally violate the Sabbath by approaching too close to the line. Jesus violated the Sabbath repeatedly and publicly, and from the perspective of the Pharisees, without adequate justification. He healed people on the Sabbath. His disciples plucked grain on the Sabbath. And when challenged, he did not apologize or argue that his actions fell within the permitted categories. He made a claim that was, from the Pharisaic perspective, either profound or outrageous. He said the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And then he said something worse. He said, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Lord of the Sabbath. This is not a claim to a better interpretation of the Sabbath regulations. This is a claim to authority over the institution itself. The Sabbath was given by God at creation, enshrined in the Ten Commandments, the most sacred component of the most sacred text in the Jewish tradition. And Jesus was saying that he had authority over it, that his judgment about what the Sabbath required superseded the accumulated wisdom of generations of Torah scholars, that the Son of Man, the figure from Daniel's vision who comes on the clouds of heaven to receive an everlasting kingdom, was standing in front of them in a Galilean synagogue, telling them they had been observing the Sabbath wrong. From within the Pharisaic framework, this was not a minor theological dispute. It was a either or. Either Jesus was who he was implying he was, in which case everything they believed about the Torah and its interpretation had to be reconsidered from the ground up, or he was a dangerous false teacher leading the people astray, in which case everything he said about the Sabbath was not a profound insight, but a seductive error that could corrupt the practice of the entire community. The second major flashpoint was purity. The Pharisaic program, as we noted, was built around the extension of temple purity into everyday life. Purity was not in this framework merely a ceremonial concern. It was a theological claim that holiness was not confined to the temple, but was available to all of Israel in daily life. And that maintaining the boundaries of purity was how you participated in the holy life of the covenant community. Jesus' approach to purity was systematically transgressive. He touched lepers who were in a state of severe ritual impurity. He allowed a woman with a hemorrhage to touch him when her condition made her ritually impure, and her touch would have transmitted that impurity. He associated with tax collectors and sinners, people who were ritually impure, not merely by accident, but by profession and lifestyle. He ate with the ritually impure without requiring them to purify themselves first. He declared all foods clean, which contradicted the explicit dietary laws of the Torah. The Gospel of Mark records the Pharisees asking Jesus directly, "Why do your disciples not wash their hands before they eat?" This is not a question about hygiene. It is a question about the oral tradition's regulation of ritual hand washing, which the Pharisees considered obligatory, and Jesus' response is withering and comprehensive. He quotes Isaiah against them, "These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me." He accuses them of setting aside the commandment of God to follow their own traditions. And then he makes the claim that was most theologically explosive. It is not what goes into a person that makes them unclean, but what comes out. From within the Pharisaic framework, this is not a pious insight about the primacy of inner over outer religion. It is a direct attack on the entire program of ritual purity that the Pharisees had spent generations developing. It is saying that the oral tradition, the fence around the Torah, the elaborate system of regulations that the Pharisees believed was the practical expression of God's will for daily life, was not merely mistaken, but was actually being used to evade the real demands of God. This is not the kind of thing you say to a movement and expect them to be pleased about it. The third flashpoint was forgiveness. In the Gospel of Mark, early in Jesus' ministry, 4 men lower a paralyzed friend through a roof to bring him to Jesus, and Jesus says to the paralyzed man, "Your sins are forgiven." The scribes who are present immediately react, "Who can forgive sins but God alone?" This is not an irrational response. In the theology of Second Temple Judaism, the forgiveness of sins was mediated through the temple sacrificial system. You brought a sacrifice. The priest performed the ritual. Atonement was made. This was the divinely ordained mechanism for forgiveness, established in the Torah, maintained by the priesthood, requiring the temple as its institutional location. Jesus was short-circuiting this entire system. He was declaring forgiveness directly, without sacrifice, without priest, without temple, on his own authority, and he was doing it publicly to an ordinary person in a house in Capernaum. The theological implication was not subtle. Either Jesus had the authority to forgive sins, which meant he had an authority that belonged to God alone, or he was uttering blasphemy in its most precise technical sense, claiming divine prerogatives that no human being could possess. The scribes chose the second interpretation, and from within their theological framework, that choice was not unreasonable. The history of Israel was full of false prophets who had led the people astray by claiming divine authority for things that contradicted the Torah. The Torah itself contains specific warnings about false prophets and specific instructions about what to do with them. The fact that a person performed miracles or gathered a large following was not, in the Torah's own framework, sufficient evidence that they spoke for God. Deuteronomy 13 explicitly says that even a prophet who performs signs and wonders must be rejected if their teaching leads people away from the God of Israel. The fourth flashpoint was the temple itself. We have discussed in previous videos how Jesus' action in the temple, overturning the tables of the money changers, was understood as a prophetic announcement of the temple's destruction. But there is a specific saying of Jesus recorded in the gospel accounts that was used at his trial, and that goes further than the prophetic announcement. Multiple witnesses at his trial testified that he had said he would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. The gospel texts say these witnesses were false, that they were misrepresenting what Jesus had actually said. The Gospel of John records Jesus making a statement about destroying this temple and raising it in 3 days in the context of the temple action, and explains that he was speaking about the temple of his body, not the physical building. But the fact that witnesses at his trial made this claim, and that the gospel writers felt the need to address it, suggests that something Jesus said had been interpreted by people who heard him as a claim to replace or supersede the temple. And within the theological framework of Second Temple Judaism, a claim to replace the temple was not merely controversial. The temple was the center of the cosmos, the dwelling place of God, the institution that made Israel Israel. A person who claimed to supersede the temple was claiming to be something more central to the relationship between God and Israel than the institution that God himself had established for that purpose. It was a claim of an order that could only be evaluated in one of two ways: as the most extraordinary divine self-disclosure in history, or as the most dangerous blasphemy ever uttered. The fifth and most explosive flashpoint was the direct question that the high priest asked at the trial: "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" And Jesus's answer in the Gospel of Mark is the most explicit claim to divine identity in the entire gospel: "I am. And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." The high priest tore his clothes. This is the specific gesture prescribed in Jewish law for when one hears blasphemy. It was not a theatrical reaction to a vague claim of spiritual significance. It was a legal and liturgical response to a specific and identifiable offense. Jesus had combined two of the most explosive texts in the Hebrew Bible: Daniel 7, where the Son of Man comes on the clouds to receive an everlasting kingdom, and Psalm 110, where the Lord says to the psalmist's Lord, "Sit at my right hand." He had placed himself at the right hand of God and claimed that he would come on the clouds of heaven in divine judgment. In the theological framework of Second Temple Judaism, the right hand of God was not a metaphor. It was a location of unique divine proximity, a position of sharing in divine authority. The Qumran community had developed elaborate speculations about heavenly figures who might share in divine authority, and the limits of those speculations were carefully policed. The claim that a specific human being standing on trial for his life in front of the Sanhedrin was already occupying that position of divine authority and would soon be manifesting it in cosmic judgment. This was not a claim that the high priest could evaluate with theological neutrality. He had two choices: believe it and recognize that the Sanhedrin was sitting in judgment over the judge of the universe, a situation that inverted every category of authority and power that the high priestly office represented, or call it blasphemy and proceed accordingly. He called it blasphemy, and within his theological framework, with the evidence available to him at that moment, the decision was not irrational. Here is what the popular understanding of this story almost always misses. The religious leaders of first century Judaism were not wrong about everything. They were right that the Sabbath was sacred. They were right that purity mattered. They were right that forgiveness required something more than a human being's declaration. They were right that the temple was the center of Israel's covenant life. They were right that a claim to sit at the right hand of God and come on the clouds of heaven was either true or blasphemous, with no middle ground. Their error, if it was an error, was not a failure of intelligence or a failure of scripture knowledge. It was a failure of imagination. They had constructed over generations of extraordinarily careful theological work a coherent picture of what faithfulness to God looked like and what God's action in history would look like. And Jesus did not fit that picture. Not because the picture was wrong in its details, but because the picture had not imagined the possibility of what Jesus represented. The scholar N.T. Wright has argued that the tragedy of the opposition to Jesus was not that his opponents were corrupt hypocrites, but that they were faithful Jews who encountered something that their faithful Judaism had not equipped them to receive. They were looking for a Messiah who would defeat Rome and restore the temple. They encountered a Messiah who said his kingdom was not of this world and that the temple was going to be destroyed. They were looking for an anointed king who would vindicate Israel against the nations. They encountered someone who said the nations were being invited into the covenant. They were looking for the day of the Lord as the day of Israel's vindication over its enemies. They encountered someone who said the day of the Lord was a day of judgment that began with Israel itself. The categories were right. The content was unexpected. And here is the deepest irony of the entire story. The people who knew the Bible best, the people who had devoted their lives to understanding and applying and transmitting the sacred texts of Israel, were the people least equipped to recognize the fulfillment of those texts when it came. Not because they had not read the texts carefully enough, but because they had read them so carefully within such a specific and well-developed interpretive framework that they could not see what was outside that framework. The same phenomenon appears in the history of science, in the history of politics, in the history of every human domain where expertise can simultaneously illuminate and blind. The experts are the people who see most clearly within the established framework. And they are sometimes the people who have the most difficulty seeing what the framework has excluded. The scribes and Pharisees and chief priests knew the Bible. They knew it better than almost anyone alive today knows any text of any kind. And their knowledge, deep and genuine and hard won, became, in this specific historical moment, the thing that prevented them from seeing what a carpenter from Galilee with no formal theological training was claiming to be. They were not villains. They were not simply corrupt. They were people who had built their lives on something true and who encountered something that claimed to be the fulfillment of that truth in a form they had not expected and could not accommodate. And 2,000 years later, the question their encounter forces on anyone who takes it seriously is still not fully answered. How do you hold your understanding of the sacred with enough conviction to live by it and with enough openness to recognize it when it shows up in a form you did not expect? The scribes and the Pharisees held their conviction, they lacked the openness, and what they did with Jesus of Nazareth is what institutions and experts and faithful believers have done in every generation with every person who showed up claiming that the thing they had built their lives around was real, but that it looked different from what they had imagined. They decided he was wrong, and then they decided he was dangerous. And then they decided that the danger he represented was more serious than the possibility that he was right. And then they acted accordingly, and the world has been arguing about whether they were wrong ever since. Here is the question I want to leave you with, the one worth arguing about in the comments and with everyone you know and in the quiet of your own mind at whatever hour you find yourself most honest. If you had been a first century Pharisee, a person who had devoted your life to the most careful and rigorous study of the sacred texts of your tradition, who had built your life around a specific and coherent understanding of what God required and what God's action in history would look like, and Jesus of Nazareth had walked into your synagogue and said the things he said and done the things he did, what would you have thought? Not with the benefit of 2,000 years of hindsight, not knowing how the story ends, not knowing about the resurrection or the empty tomb or the 3 centuries of martyrs or the conversion of Constantine or any of it. Just a Galilean preacher in your synagogue, claiming authority over the Sabbath, declaring forgiveness without sacrifice, touching lepers, eating with sinners, and telling you that the temple was about to be destroyed and that he was the fulfillment of everything you had spent your life studying. What would you have thought? Because the answer to that question is not as obvious as 2,000 years of Christian tradition has made it seem. And sitting with the discomfort of that not obviousness might be the most honest thing any of us can do with this story.